The ridge loomed ahead through the pre-dawn darkness, its jagged silhouette carved against a sky still bleeding smoke from yesterday's bombardment. Private First Class Desmond Doss crouched behind a shattered tree stump, his medical pack heavy against his shoulders, watching the other medics shake their heads and pull back toward the relative safety of the lower slopes. The wounded were up there, somewhere beyond that killing ground of exposed rock and crater-pocked earth, but 3 evacuation attempts had already failed. Captain Glover studied the terrain through his binoculars, the lenses fogged with moisture from the constant drizzle that had turned Hacksaw Ridge into a slick nightmare of coral and mud. The 77th Infantry Division had taken the plateau at terrible cost, only to find themselves pinned down by Japanese positions dug deep into the limestone caves. Now, 12 hours later, the order had come down. Pull back and regroup. We can't get stretcher teams up there, Glover muttered to his sergeant. Machine gun nests still command every approach. It's suicide. But Doss was already checking his supplies. Morphine, sulfur powder, bandages, tourniquets. His hands trembled as he adjusted the coil of rope around his shoulder, the same type of rope that had snapped under the weight of the last stretcher, sending 2 wounded men tumbling back into the mud. Command had scrounged a replacement from the engineers, but the hemp fiber looked worn, and Doss knew it would have to hold not just wounded bodies, but the desperate hope of every man trapped on that ridge. The failed assault had begun before dawn, when Baker Company pushed toward the Japanese positions. The attack stalled within minutes. Enemy fire swept the open ground like an invisible scythe, and the men who reached the ridge found themselves pinned among the rocks, unable to advance or retreat. Radio contact had been lost, ammunition was running low, and somewhere in that maze of stone and smoke, at least 15 wounded Americans lay bleeding, calling for help that seemed impossible to deliver. Private Morrison, a rifleman who'd never quite trusted the medic who refused to carry a weapon, watched Doss from across the staging area. The kid was praying again, lips moving silently over that small Bible he kept in his breast pocket. Morrison had heard the stories. The Seventh-day Adventist who'd endured months of ridicule before proving himself in the field. Some called him crazy. Others whispered that his faith made him fearless. But Morrison could see the truth in Doss's face. He was terrified. "He won't dare," Morrison muttered to the squad leader. "Kid's got no weapon, no backup. It's suicide." The first grey light touched the horizon, revealing the true scope of Okinawa's brutal landscape. The ridge rose like a fortress wall, its coral face streaked with rain and scarred by countless shell impacts. Below, in the relative shelter of the approach, stretcher-bearers waited with empty litters, their faces grim with the knowledge that every minute of delay meant another man might bleed out in the rocks above. Doss stood slowly, testing the weight of his pack. The rope felt heavier than usual, coiled across his shoulder like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Through the drizzle he could hear them, faint calls echoing from the plateau above, voices growing weaker as the hours passed. "Medic!" The cry drifted down through the morning air, barely audible over the distant rumble of artillery. Captain Glover appeared at Doss's shoulder, his face drawn with exhaustion and something approaching desperation. "Doss, I can't order you to go up there. The position's untenable. We're pulling back to regroup." "I understand, sir. The wounded. We'll have to leave them for now. Send artillery forward, try to suppress those machine gun nests, then go back with a full company." Doss nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the cliff face above. Somewhere in that labyrinth of coral and shadow, men were dying, men who'd called his name in the darkness, who'd trusted him to find them when everyone else had given up hope. The rope seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, a physical reminder of the choice that lay before him. "How many, sir? What? How many men are still up there?" Glover's jaw tightened. "Best estimate? 15, maybe 20. But Doss, those positions are zeroed in. Every approach is covered. You'd never make it halfway up." The medic's hands found the worn pages of his Bible. fingers tracing words he'd memorized long before he'd ever heard of Okinawa or Hacksaw Ridge. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, reading from the same book at their kitchen table back in Virginia. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." But this wasn't about laying down his life. This was about climbing up to find it. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The ascent began in silence. Doss moved carefully along the muddy path that zigzagged up the face of Hacksaw Ridge, each step calculated to avoid loose coral that might give way and send him tumbling back down the 70-foot cliff. The rope dragged behind him, catching on twisted metal and broken tree roots, a constant reminder of the impossible task ahead. Above, the Japanese positions remained ominously quiet, as if the enemy soldiers were waiting to see what this lone American intended to do. Private Morrison watched from below, his rifle clutched uselessly in his hands. He'd volunteered to provide covering fire, but from this angle he couldn't see the machine gun nests that commanded the approaches to the ridge. All he could do was watch Doss disappear into the morning mist, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that one misstep would end everything. "What's he doing?" Morrison whispered to Sergeant Collins, who crouched beside him behind a shattered palm tree. "His job," Collins replied, but his voice carried a mixture of admiration and something approaching fear. The sergeant had seen plenty of courage in his 3 years with the 77th Infantry Division. But this was different. This was one man walking into a killing field because he couldn't bear the sound of wounded soldiers calling his name. The first 100 yards of the climb took Doss 20 minutes. Sniper fire cracked overhead, forcing him to belly crawl between the larger boulders, his medical pack scraping against the rough coral. The rain had turned the ridge face into a treacherous maze of slick surfaces and hidden drop-offs. Twice he had to backtrack when the path proved impassable, and once he nearly lost his grip when a mortar round exploded close enough to shower him with debris. Halfway up, Doss found the first body. Private Jenkins, a kid from Ohio who'd joined the company just 2 weeks earlier, lay crumpled against a coral outcropping, his rifle shattered beside him. But as Doss knelt to check for signs of life, he heard something that made his heart race, a faint moan echoing from somewhere above. The sound galvanized him. Moving with new urgency, Doss continued his climb, following the narrow path that led to the top of the ridge. The Japanese positions were carved deep into the coral caves, invisible from below, but commanding perfect fields of fire across the plateau. He could feel their eyes on him as he moved, waiting for him to expose himself enough for a clean shot. At the top, the true scope of the disaster became clear. The plateau stretched before him like a moonscape, cratered and barren, littered with abandoned equipment and the still forms of American soldiers. The 77th Infantry Division had gained this ground at terrible cost, only to find themselves trapped in an exposed position with no cover and no way forward. The withdrawal had been chaotic, leaving the wounded scattered across nearly 200 yards of open terrain. The first man Doss found was Corporal Hayes, conscious but gut-shot, his face grey with shock. Hayes gripped his wrist with surprising strength as Doss worked quickly, applying pressure dressings and injecting morphine, while enemy bullets sparked off the rocks around them. "How you going to get me down?" Hayes whispered. Doss looked at the rope coiled on his shoulder, then at the sheer drop behind them. He'd never attempted a single-man evacuation from this kind of terrain, especially under fire. But he began fashioning a harness from the hemp, testing knots with fingers that wanted to shake, speaking quietly to Hayes about anything except the impossibility of what they were attempting. "You married, Hayes?" 2 years come Christmas." "What's her name?" "Sarah May. Works at the telephone company back in Pittsburgh." The descent took 47 minutes. Doss braced himself against an outcropping, feeding the rope through his hands as Hayes bumped and scraped down the cliff face. Twice the hemp began to fray, individual strands popping under the strain. Once, a burst of machine gun fire from one of the caves forced Doss to freeze for nearly 10 minutes, Hayes dangling helplessly in space while bullets chipped coral just inches from the rope. When Hayes finally touched solid ground, a cheer rose from the men waiting at the bottom, quickly hushed as they remembered the enemy was listening. Medics rushed forward to take Hayes to the aid station, but Doss was already climbing back up, the frayed rope coiled once again across his shoulder. From his position below, Captain Glover watched through his binoculars, his jaw clenched with a mixture of admiration and growing dread. One man down, but how many more were up there? And how long could that rope hold under repeated stress? The hemp was already showing signs of wear, and they had no replacement if it snapped completely. "Sir," Morrison called softly, "should we send up support?" Glover shook his head. More men would only draw more fire, and the approaches were still commanded by those invisible machine gun nests. For now, all they could do was watch and wait, and pray that Doss's stubborn faith would prove stronger than Japanese steel. On the ridge above, Doss moved deeper into the plateau, following the sound of voices that grew weaker with each passing hour. The rain continued to fall, turning the coral dust into slick mud and making every step treacherous. But somewhere in that maze of stone and shadow, men were dying. Men who'd called his name in the darkness, who'd trusted him to find them when everyone else had given up hope. And the rope, frayed but holding, remained his only lifeline to the world below. By noon, Doss had found 6 more wounded soldiers scattered across the plateau of Hacksaw Ridge. Each evacuation became a separate nightmare of ropework and improvisation. The hemp grew slick with rain and blood, and his hands were raw from feeding the line through his palms. The Japanese snipers had begun to anticipate his movements, and twice he'd been forced to abandon a wounded man temporarily when enemy fire became too intense. Private Second Class Nakamura, a Japanese-American soldier from the 442nd who'd been attached to the 77th Infantry Division, lay semi-conscious behind a shattered coral formation. When he saw Doss approaching through the drizzle, he tried to wave him away with a blood-soaked hand. "Leave me," he whispered. Not worth the risk, but Doss was already kneeling beside him, checking the shrapnel wound in his shoulder. Nakamura's presence with the unit had been complicated. A young man, fighting to prove his loyalty while enduring suspicion from some of his own countrymen. Now, bleeding on an Okinawan ridge, those distinctions seemed meaningless. "Every man's worth it," Doss said simply, reaching for his remaining bandages. The descent with Nakamura proved the most difficult yet. The soldier drifted in and out of consciousness, making it nearly impossible to keep him properly positioned in the makeshift harness. Halfway down the cliff face, a mortar round exploded close enough to send both men swinging wildly against the coral wall. The rope held, but Doss could feel individual strands beginning to part under the repeated stress. Captain Glover waited at the bottom with growing anxiety. 7 men evacuated, but intelligence reports suggested at least 8 more wounded remained on the plateau. The rope was clearly deteriorating, and enemy fire had intensified as the Japanese defenders realized what was happening. Each trip up took longer, each descent became more precarious. "Doss!" Glover called as the medic prepared for his 8th climb. "That rope won't hold much longer. We need to get you a replacement." "How long would that take, sir?" Glover's silence was answer enough. The nearest engineer unit was miles away, and by the time they could bring proper climbing equipment, the remaining wounded would be dead. The captain watched Doss check his medical supplies, morphine running low, bandages nearly exhausted, and saw the determination in the young man's eyes. "Just one more," Doss said quietly. "Let me try for just one more." In the aid station below, Dr. Brennan worked frantically over the stream of casualties that kept arriving from the ridge. Each man told the same story, the medic with no weapon who kept climbing back up into hell, Brennan had seen plenty of courage in his 18 months with the 77th Infantry Division, but this defied medical logic. No single man could sustain that kind of physical and psychological stress without breaking. How many more times can he do this? Brennan asked the orderly who helped unload Nakamura from the stretcher. The orderly, a veteran of 3 Pacific campaigns, shook his head. Until the rope breaks or they kill him, I guess. That's just who he is. The 8th wounded man was Sergeant Willis, a platoon leader who'd been hit during the initial assault and had spent nearly 18 hours bleeding among the coral formations. When Doss found him, Willis was barely conscious, but still trying to direct an imaginary defense of his position. "Fall back to the secondary line," Willis mumbled as Doss worked on his wounds. "Can't hold this position. Too exposed." "It's okay, Sergeant. We're going down now." Willis focused on Doss's face with difficulty. "You're the medic, the one they talk about." "I'm just trying to help." "No weapon, no weapon." Willis managed a weak smile. "Crazy bastard. They told me you were crazy." The rope snapped during Willis's descent. For one heart-stopping moment, the sergeant plummeted through empty air before crashing onto a narrow ledge 15 feet above the ground. Doss rappelled down after him, using torn cloth and equipment straps, finding Willis unconscious but breathing. Together, they fashioned another line from whatever materials they could find: belt webbing, torn clothing, parachute cords scavenged from the plateau. The improvised rescue took nearly 2 hours, and when they finally reached the bottom, both men were bloodied and exhausted. But Willis would live, making 8 successful evacuations from a position everyone had written off as hopeless. As evening approached, the sounds from the ridge began to fade. Either the remaining wounded had been found, or they'd grown too weak to call for help. Doss sat in the mud beside the frayed remains of his original rope, his hands shaking with exhaustion and something approaching shock. Around him, medics prepared stretchers and checked supplies, but their movements seemed to happen at a distance. Captain Glover approached carefully, recognizing the signs of a man who'd pushed far beyond normal human limits. "Doss, how are you holding up?" The medic looked up at the ridge, now shrouded in evening mist. Somewhere up there, silence had replaced the calls for help that had drawn him back again and again throughout the long day. The silence should have been a relief, but it felt heavier than the cries had been. I think that's all of them, sir." But even as he spoke, Doss wasn't entirely sure. The plateau was vast, and there were places he hadn't been able to search thoroughly. The thought that he might have missed someone, that a wounded soldier might still be lying among the coral formations, waiting for help that would never come, would stay with him long after the official reports were written. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Darkness fell over Hacksaw Ridge like a shroud, but Doss couldn't shake the feeling that his work wasn't finished. The official count showed 8 wounded soldiers evacuated from the plateau, more than anyone had thought possible. But something nagged at him as he sat in the company aid station, his hands wrapped in bandages where the rope had burned through to raw flesh. Private Morrison approached him hesitantly, carrying a canteen cup filled with hot coffee. The rifleman who'd once doubted the unarmed medic's courage now looked at Doss with something approaching reverence, but also deep unease. "You should get some rest," Morrison said quietly. "Doc says you've got rope burns down to the bone." Doss accepted the coffee gratefully, though his hands shook too badly to drink it without help. The caffeine was bitter and wonderful, cutting through the fog of exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. But even as his body cried out for rest, his mind remained fixed on the ridge above. "Morrison," he said finally, "when you were up there yesterday before the withdrawal, how many men were in your squad?" 12. "Why?" "I've been counting. 8 evacuated, but the casualty reports from other units? I think there might be more." Morrison's face went pale. The thought that wounded soldiers might still be lying on that exposed plateau, growing weaker through the long night, was almost unbearable. But the improvised rope system had failed completely, and without proper equipment, another climb would be suicide. "Doss, you can't. Not in the dark, not without gear." But the medic was already standing, testing his balance against the wooden support beam of the aid station. Dr. Brennan appeared immediately, his face stern with medical authority. "Absolutely not. You're suffering from exhaustion, dehydration, and severe lacerations to both hands. I'm ordering you to rest. Doc, if there are still men up there, then they'll have to wait until we can mount a proper rescue operation. With equipment and support, you've done enough for one day." Doss wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. The events of the day had taken a toll that went beyond physical exhaustion. Each trip up the cliff face, each wounded man lowered through enemy fire, had carved itself into his memory with startling clarity. He could still feel the rope sliding through his bleeding palms, still hear the soft impact of bodies reaching safety at the bottom of the cliff. Captain Glover entered the aid station, his uniform soaked with rain, and his face drawn with the weight of command decisions. Behind him came Lieutenant Colonel Coolidge, the battalion commander, who'd driven forward from regimental headquarters after receiving reports of the day's evacuation efforts. "Private Doss," Coolidge said formally, "I understand we owe you a considerable debt." "Just doing my job, sir. Your job doesn't require climbing a vertical cliff face 8 times under enemy fire. What you did today, it goes far beyond duty." But Doss barely heard the words of commendation. His attention was fixed on the sound of rain drumming against the canvas roof of the aid station, a rhythm that reminded him of bullets striking coral. Somewhere in his mind, he was still on the ridge, still listening for voices calling his name through the darkness. The official after-action reports would be written the next morning. Clean, factual sentences that reduced the day's events to military statistics. PFC Doss successfully evacuated 8 wounded personnel from an exposed position under heavy enemy fire. The reports wouldn't mention the way his hands had trembled as he tied each knot, or the prayers he'd whispered while lowering each man down the cliff face. They wouldn't capture the terrible silence that had finally fallen over the plateau, or the question that would haunt him for decades. Had he found them all? As the night deepened, exhaustion finally claimed him. Doss slept fitfully on a stretcher in the aid station, his dreams filled with fraying rope and the echo of voices calling from impossible distances. Sometimes he woke thinking he heard someone calling for a medic, but it was only the wind moving through the coral formations above. The wounded men he'd evacuated lay in field hospitals miles from the ridge, most of them unaware of how they'd been saved. Corporal Hayes would recover fully and return to his wife Sarah in Pittsburgh, carrying shrapnel scars and the memory of being lowered through space by a man who refused to carry a weapon. Sergeant Willis would receive a medical discharge and spend the rest of his life trying to explain to people how it felt to be rescued by someone he'd once called crazy. The rope itself, what remained of it, was gathered up by supply personnel and marked for disposal. Hemp wasn't supposed to be used for human evacuation, and the frayed strands showed clear signs of failure, but Sergeant Collins quietly salvaged a length of it, coiling the worn fiber carefully and storing it with his personal effects. Years later, he would take it out occasionally, running the rough hemp through his fingers and remembering the day one man's stubborn faith had turned an impossible situation into something approaching miraculous. On the ridge above, the Japanese defenders settled into their caves for another long night, puzzled by the day's events. They'd watched the lone American climb repeatedly into their killing field, somehow avoiding death while evacuating wounded soldiers one by one. Some of the enemy soldiers had deliberately held their fire during the later evacuations, uncertain whether they were witnessing courage or madness. The plateau itself lay empty now, scarred by shell craters and littered with abandoned equipment. But something had changed there during those long hours of rain and blood and desperate rope work. The coral formations that had witnessed so much death had also seen something else, a kind of stubborn love that refused to accept the arithmetic of war, that insisted one more climb was always possible, one more wounded soldier could always be saved. 3 days after the evacuation from Hacksaw Ridge, Doss sat in the chaplain's tent, his bandaged hands folded carefully in his lap. Chaplain Bradley had requested the meeting after reading the preliminary reports of the rescue operation, but now he seemed uncertain how to begin the conversation. "The men are calling it miraculous," Bradley said finally. 8 lives saved from an impossible position. Some are saying it was divine intervention. Doss shifted uncomfortably. The word miraculous didn't match his memory of those terrifying hours on the cliff face, the desperate improvisation with fraying rope, the moments when he'd been certain the next bullet would find its mark. "Chaplain, I was scared every minute up there. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely tie the knots. If that's divine intervention, it doesn't feel the way I expected." "Fear doesn't disqualify faith, son. Sometimes it proves it." But Doss harbored a secret that he couldn't share with the chaplain, couldn't include in any official report. During his final climb to the plateau, he'd found something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A 9th wounded soldier, Private Kowalski, hidden behind a coral formation he'd missed during his earlier searches. Kowalski had been hit during the initial assault and had crawled into a depression between 2 large rocks, where he'd slowly bled to death over the course of 18 hours. When Doss found him, the soldier had been dead for at least 6 hours, close enough to salvation that he might have survived if the medic had searched more systematically, if he'd been braver, if he'd climbed faster. The discovery had broken something inside Doss. He'd knelt beside Kowalski's body in the growing darkness, his medical training confirming what his heart already knew. This death was preventable. All his successful evacuations, all the praise from officers and admiration from fellow soldiers, couldn't erase the fact that he'd missed one voice that had called his name in the darkness and received no answer. "Chaplain, what if saving 8 men isn't enough? What if there was one more you should have found?" Bradley studied the young medic's face, recognizing the signs of survivor's guilt that plagued so many good soldiers. "Doss, you can't save everyone. No man can carry that responsibility. But I keep thinking, if I'd been faster, or searched more carefully, or climbed one more time when I thought I was finished, the weight of Kowalski's death would stay with Doss long after the war ended, long after the citations and medals and hometown parades. In quiet moments, lying awake in civilian beds decades later, he would still hear that 9th voice calling from the ridge, still feel the guilt of arriving too late. But there was something else he couldn't tell the chaplain, something that emerged only years later during therapy sessions at veterans' hospitals. The rope, that miraculous hemp that had held 8 times under impossible stress, had actually been defective from the beginning. A quartermaster investigation after the war revealed that the line had been damaged during transport, weakened by saltwater exposure and rough handling. Any reasonable engineer would have condemned it as unsafe for human evacuation. The fact that it had held as long as it did was luck, not divine providence. On any of those 8 descents, the rope could have snapped, sending both Doss and his patients plummeting to their deaths. The mathematics of survival had been far more precarious than anyone realized. "You want to know the truth, chaplain? I wasn't brave up there. I was just too stubborn to quit, and too scared of living with the voices to walk away." "Sometimes," Bradley said quietly, "that's what courage looks like. Not fearlessness, but stubborn love in the face of fear." In the years that followed, Doss would struggle with the legend that grew around the Hacksaw Ridge evacuation. Newspaper accounts would inflate the numbers, describe superhuman endurance, transform his terrified prayers into confident declarations of faith. The story would take on a life of its own, becoming a parable about divine protection and unwavering courage. But Doss would remember the tremor in his hands as he tied each knot, the moments when he'd been certain he couldn't climb one more time. The discovery of Kowalski's body in the coral depression. He would remember that heroism felt nothing like the movies suggested. It was cold and wet and terrifying, powered by guilt and love in equal measure. The real miracle wasn't that the rope had held, or that enemy bullets had missed their mark. The miracle was that one man's refusal to accept the arithmetic of war, his insistence that just one more wounded soldier could always be saved, had been enough to bring 8 men home. 8 families who would gather around dinner tables again, 8 voices that would tell stories to children and grandchildren, and one voice that would remain forever silent on the ridge, a reminder that even in the midst of miraculous rescue, war extracted its price with mathematical precision. Doss would carry both realities for the rest of his life. The joy of salvation and the weight of the one he couldn't save, the legend that made him famous and the truth that kept him humble. "Chaplain," he said finally, "when they write the reports, make sure they remember it wasn't just me up there. It was every man who tied those knots, every medic who caught the wounded at the bottom, every soldier who provided covering fire. Heroes don't work alone." Bradley nodded, but he knew the truth as well as Doss did. In the end, it had been one man on a cliff face with a fraying rope, choosing again and again to climb into hell because love wouldn't let him stay safe below. 27 years later, Desmond Doss stood in his small workshop in Georgia, holding a coil of hemp rope that looked remarkably similar to the one he'd used on Hacksaw Ridge. His hands, still bearing faint scars from that long-ago day on Okinawa, traced the worn fibers with the careful attention of a man who understood the difference between life and death could be measured in the strength of individual strands. The rope wasn't the original that had been disposed of by army quartermasters decades earlier. This was just a piece of ordinary hemp he'd bought at a hardware store. But on rainy afternoons, when the sound of water drumming against his workshop roof reminded him too much of bullets striking coral, he would hold it and remember. A letter lay open on his workbench, handwritten in the careful script of an elderly man. Corporal Hayes, now Dr. Hayes, having used his GI benefits to attend medical school, wrote every year on the anniversary of his rescue. His latest letter included a photograph of his granddaughter, a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to the wife he'd spoken about during those 47 minutes of descent through enemy fire. "Sarah passed last winter," Hayes had written, "but she never forgot that you brought me home to her. We had 43 years together because of what you did that day. Our granddaughter is studying to be a nurse. She says she wants to help people the way you helped me." Doss set the letter aside carefully, his eyes moist with emotion that had nothing to do with the dampness in the workshop air. Hayes was one of 7 men who still wrote to him regularly, sharing updates about children and careers, grandchildren and retirements, 7 voices that had made it home from the ridge, 7 lives that had unfolded across decades because of a few hours of desperate rope work. But he never heard from Kowalski's family. That silence had become its own form of correspondence, a reminder of the mathematics of war that no amount of courage could completely overcome. Sometimes Doss would dream about climbing the rope one more time, searching the coral formations more systematically, arriving at that hidden depression 6 hours earlier when it might have made a difference. The nightmares had faded over the years, replaced by something more complex, an understanding that heroism was always incomplete, that even the most miraculous rescues cast shadows of the ones who couldn't be saved. The legend that had grown around Hacksaw Ridge emphasized divine protection and unwavering faith, but Doss knew the truth was more complicated. His Medal of Honor sat in a drawer in his bedroom, wrapped in tissue paper alongside the commendations and citations that had accumulated after the war. Visitors sometimes asked to see them, but Doss preferred to show them the letters instead. tangible proof that courage was measured not in medals, but in decades of life that followed, in children raised and families loved, and ordinary kindnesses extended by men who'd been given a second chance. A knock at the workshop door interrupted his reverie. His neighbor, a veteran of Vietnam who'd moved in next door the previous spring, stood holding a cup of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd been wrestling with unspoken questions. "Mr. Doss, I hope I'm not bothering you, but I wanted to ask, how do you live with it? The things you did, the men you saved. Doesn't it feel like too much responsibility?" Doss gestured for the young man to sit on the wooden stool beside his workbench. He'd heard variations of this question many times over the years, usually from veterans struggling with their own memories of combat, their own impossible choices between duty and survival. "Son, I learned something on that ridge that took me decades to understand. You don't save people by being fearless. You save them by being more afraid of living with their deaths than you are of dying yourself. But the stories they tell, the way people talk about what you did, it sounds like you were certain, like you never doubted." Doss picked up the rope again, letting the hemp fibers slide through his scarred fingers. "I was terrified every minute up there. My hands shook so badly, I could barely tie the knots. But sometimes being scared is what makes you careful enough to get the job done." The rain had stopped, leaving the afternoon air clean and bright. Through the workshop window, Doss could see children playing in the street, their laughter carrying on the gentle breeze. Normal sounds of a normal day in a peaceful world that existed because young men had once climbed impossible cliffs with fraying rope and stubborn love. "The real miracle," he said finally, "wasn't that I brought those men down. It was that I found the courage to climb up in the first place, knowing I might not come back. And that came from something bigger than me, something I still don't fully understand." Years later, after Doss had passed away and the workshop had been cleaned out by family members, they would find dozens of letters from the men he'd saved, their children and grandchildren. They would find the piece of hemp rope, carefully preserved, and a small journal where he'd recorded not his heroic actions, but his regrets. The places he should have searched more thoroughly, the wounded he might have missed, the weight of being called a hero when he knew how imperfect his courage had been. But they would also find something else, a list of names written in careful script, updated annually for nearly 3 decades. 8 names of men who'd made it home from Hacksaw Ridge, followed by the names of their wives and children and grandchildren. A family tree of life that had grown from a few hours of desperate rope work on an Okinawan cliff. The legend would endure, growing more polished with each retelling, inspiring new generations of soldiers and medics and ordinary people facing impossible choices. But for those who knew him personally, Desmond Doss would be remembered not as a fearless hero, but as something more remarkable. A frightened young man who'd found the strength to climb into hell because love wouldn't let him stay safely below. And sometimes, when rain drummed against windows on quiet afternoons, they would think of rope and remember that the distance between legend and truth is often measured not in facts, but in the scars that heroism leaves on the hands of those who refuse to let go. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.